Hello and welcome to this episode of the Montpelier Happy Hour here on WBEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro, your community radio station. I am your host, Olga Peters, and this is the show where we talk about how things in the state capitol shake out for the rest of us. I want to welcome to the show this week, of course, regular contributor Emily Kornheiser from Brattleboro. Hey, Emily.
Hi, Olga.
And we get to talk, we're talking ARPA again, because even though we did it last week, there is so much to talk about. And so I want to welcome to the show Katie Buckley, who is the director of the ARPA Assistance and Coordination Program for the Vermont League of Cities and Towns, and Carolyn Wesley, who is chief of staff for the Senate President Pro Tempore, Becca Ballin. And so glad you can be joining us. While Katie will be giving us some of the nuts and bolts on ARPA, Carolyn has been gathering feedback from the public input process. So I'm really excited today that we'll be able to get such high-level state views of the municipal funding that will be coming to communities. Now, Katie, I went on VLCT's website today, and as I understand it, almost $200 million will be coming to municipalities. And VLCT is recommending them to dream big. So tell us what's happening right now. When's the money coming? Has some of it arrived? What are kind of the questions you're getting from towns?
Sure. Oh, I'd be happy to. So thank you for inviting me today. I'm delighted to be here. I love talking about ARPA. It's my full-time job. That's what I do all day, every day. And it's an exciting subject because for the first time since the 1980s, municipalities are getting money directly from the federal government. And so I don't know how much has been covered it before, but the state of Vermont is getting $1.25 billion. About $1 million of it will go through the state. Emily, you did the hard work in Montpelier of figuring out where about half of that's going to go during this last session. The other half comes next session, if I'm correct, and you can feel free to chime in.
And Carolyn is going to talk to us about this very fun listening tour that's happened this summer to make sure that Vermonters are informing that process.
Fantastic, because there are 277 towns eagerly awaiting what's next. And so, Olga, as you said, about $200 million is going out directly to municipalities. It is a larger pot of money than was originally intended because all of that county money, about $121 million, thanks to our congressional delegation, the governor, VLCT, others who pushed on Treasury, they changed the ruling and the language that allows for Vermont, the county money to go directly to municipalities since we don't have county form of government, which makes the municipalities' ARPA awards even bigger. So what started out as about 70 million, 58 million for non-entitlement units of local governments versus 20 million for the metro cities, which are Burlington and South Burlington. Add on top of that $121 million, which is about 200 million. It's a lot of money. So we had 277 municipalities, towns, cities, villages that certified to accept their ARPA awards, which is amazing. We were very quicker than other states to get that done, which was exciting. And I'm going to keep saying it's a lot of money. It's real money. So I'm going to break it down a little bit just to give context. So 277 towns, 65 towns will receive $750,000 or more. 97 towns will receive more than $500,000. 186 towns will receive $250,000 or greater. 249 of 277 will receive $100,000 or greater. When was the last time, if you are involved in local government in any way, that you say, oh, here's $100,000 and here's a pretty broad array of ways to spend it. Go forth and spend. If you've ever applied for a grant, you look at this and say, because it's like a grant turned on its head. And so for a normal project, let's say you want to do a sidewalk project in your community. You identify the project, you go through feasibility, you determine a budget, you start figuring out all the grants that you can apply for. You go through the very rigorous process of applying for that money, often to be told no. Your project churns and churns and churns until it accumulates enough funding that you can actually get a shovel in the ground. And by the time you get that shovel in the ground, your residents are saying, this took forever. Now, here you go, here's the money. You don't have a project identified, right? It's completely upside down in the grant world. So, yeah, go ahead.
Olga and I have just been talking so much about, we've basically been talking about the pandemic constantly since the pandemic started, as has everyone else in Vermont.
Yeah.
And at the beginning, we were talking about a lot about sort of the potential in this time, what was being unearthed, what was being unveiled, the cracks being widened, what we could all see, all of those things. And then we all sort of descended deeper into our holes and lost track of that. But the dreaming potential in these open funds for the state and these open funds for the town is just incredible. So I would love, before we even get into mechanics, to talk a little bit more about like how people are using this to dream. And I wonder if Carolyn could share a little bit about sort of the dreaming that she's facilitating.
That's my other unofficial title, Dream Facilitator. Carolyn Wesley. So as Katie and Emily referenced, the way the legislature has approached this big pot of money for the state, and again, that's separate from the pot of money that goes directly to municipalities, and actually a couple of other pots of money that go directly to education and some other things, is that it's very different from the federal surplus dollars that came immediately before in the first phase of the pandemic, and those had to be spent within a year. So it was all about getting the money out the door, deciding where it was needed most, trying to get it and get people to spend it. These ARPA dollars have a much longer runway, and so as a result, the legislature said, we know their immediate needs, let's appropriate these dollars, get some of them out the door, but let's also hold on to some of them because there is this transformational opportunity. We wouldn't want to be in a situation where we're spending money quickly and realize we spent it on the wrong things. So as Katie mentioned, in the last year's legislative budget, we appropriated about half of the dollars and also signaled how we might spend some of the future dollars in big ways. And there were a couple of big budgets, which included housing, broadband, climate, and a couple of other things, business recovery, general sort of recovery for Vermont communities. And the other thing that we wrote into the budget was that legislative leadership, House Speaker Jill Kerwinsky, and my boss, Senate President Pro Tem, and Windham County superstar Becca Ballant, would lead this statewide conversation with Vermonters about how to use the dollars. And I actually pulled up the language from the budget because when my counterpart, the Speaker's Chief of Staff, they had this idea. They came to us and said, we want to put this in the budget. And this was the language that they shared to see if it was okay with our office. The community engagement process shall maximize public engagement, especially of marginalized communities, using non-traditional public input processes that do not rely exclusively on public hearings or online options, with the goal of removing barriers to participation. And I said, that sounds great. Do you have a plan for how to do it? Because of course, if you've ever worked in a community organization or been a politician or been a municipal leader, public engagement is really hard to do. And I think people have been trying to figure out how to do that for a long time. And so we spent a lot of the summer thinking about what it would look like to have this dreaming conversation with Vermonters. And some feedback we got really early on is that even though this is a conversation that's really about a budgeting process and an investing process and a specific pot of money with specific parameters, most Vermonters don't come to the conversation in that way, or if we framed the conversation in that way, that might actually be a barrier to participation. And so we have been working with a wonderful consultant named Molly Loomis, and she helped us think about the questions that we'd want to ask Vermonters. And so we just started with, what's one thing that's working really well in your community? What's one of the biggest challenges in your community? And what's one investment that could be made to strengthen your community or Vermont? And then we sort of came up with this sub-question because we realized even asking people investment about how to invest sometimes became a scary thing. And so the alternate third question is, if you had a magic wand to wave, what would you change about Vermont? because this money is the magic wand. And so, or could be if we use it correctly. So the other thing that we thought about was, as that legislative language said, there is a traditional legislative public hearing process, which usually looks like a committee or some body of legislators sort of announcing that they're taking a topic on an issue, and then people can sign up to participate. Emily, you've recently led some of these. What, you usually have like 2 minutes?
2 minutes or 3 minutes.
Yeah, so people come in, they have their 2 or 3 minutes, depending on how many people are there. They're cut off, when they reach that 2 minutes, or maybe they get a little extra time. And it's usually not really a dialogue, right? It's kind of one person after another addressing the committee. Hopefully someone's taking good notes. Sometimes that's happening better than other times, and then the committee can go and respond to it. But I don't think of that structure as a structure designed for dreaming, right? So one of the things that we talked about is, how could we think about this a little differently, help people be in conversation with, yes, the speaker and the pro tem, but also with each other and their community members. And so that's why we picked these 3 questions. We have ended up doing most of the conversations via Zoom because of where we are with case rates in Vermont and just what it felt like to try to get a room full of people together at this moment. Still feels a little like that could be a barrier. We know there are also barriers to participation when it is Zoom-based, right? Not everyone can do that. But we've seen pretty good attendance, and so we've turned these conversations into small group conversations. So it's not a town hall. It's not about primarily the speaker or the pro tem talking. It's about people in a room together, getting in a small room, and answering these 3 questions. And the other thing I would and then we have a couple of other avenues for entry that I'll talk about more. I don't want to take up too much time in one chunk. And I'm trying to figure out where to get my microphone in the right spot. Olga, tell me when it feels
Oh, that was good.
Right here?
Yeah.
Okay.
Because now you're not.
All right.
That's great.
My beautiful chin's not sort of bumping against it.
Editing on the fly. Thank you, Carolyn, for that.
No problem. I'll take a moment to say that multiple people have described the chief of staff job as a traffic controller in the State House. And when I was handed these headphones, I was like, oh, I'm a literal traffic controller.
Even orange
or
baton.
or a phone operator, or Britney Spears in like a 90s concert. Those are my different, depending on the day. That's how I think about my headset.
They all really work.
So I'm going to pause there on our outreach process and see where that goes in the conversation.
Well, I really want to hear from Katie, like what are towns doing to like hear from their people? Because most towns don't really have a particularly structured process for these kinds of decisions either, because they've never had to make them before.
I'll tell you, it's so refreshing to hear at that bigger level of what you're discussing about community engagement, that on the local level, towns experience the exact same thing. And it is a topic that we talk about a lot. If you've ever been through a really uncomfortable public meeting, you're terrified to do community engagement, right? That's like, it's fear that really holds people back from just making it, just having it be an agenda item and saying, oh, yep, we had a public dialogue about it, versus going that deeper out into the community. It can get pretty uncomfortable. And actually, we just have our next issue of VLCT News. There's a pretty robust article in there on community engagement and tips and tricks. And it's about listening, not talking as leaders, and that making the effort to do it reveals so much more. And Carolyn, you're talking about, rather than leading them to a topic, trying to draw out what wouldn't necessarily come up, and providing a forum for folks to do that. It's a huge topic, and where it's not a requirement in the law, it's a best practice. I mean, and when I'm telling municipalities, when they're asking, how do we do this? It's like, don't think of it as a ARPA, input gathering. Think of it as your community's prioritization opportunity. So you call it dreaming, I call it blue sky. I said, what's your blue sky? Get your residents together and have them do every idea they can think of. even if it is the most wishful thinking, write them all down.
And
And then
Katie,
go-
we'd be happy to share with any municipalities our 4 questions, our note-taking
Yeah.
template, like all the things we put together to do the statewide, to your point, could easily be replicated
Yeah.
at a town
And
hall. So happy to share.
Carolyn, I'm going to tell you, I've been asking to borrow a lot. Not stealing, but asking to borrow a lot. And where everything is so quickly moving, we don't really have the structure in place to support it. Kind of all hit. Normally, when you have something land, you organize, you tee up, you educate, you have your tools, all of that, and then you launch. And this money just landed and it's more reactionary. So not to say too much, but we're hoping, VLCT is hoping to partner with Vermont Council on Rural Development, maybe also partner with UVM Extension to bring in some interns who do local government work and create a community engagement toolkit, a robust kit that will be helpful in ARPA, but long beyond ARPA's gone. I feel like so much of the work that we're doing now to create best practices, form good habits, strengthen local leadership only has benefit well beyond ARPA. It's just a moment to autocorrect, I guess, I don't know if that's even the right term, but to reset the way that you do things and forge a path forward. So all of this is about emerging stronger, right, from the pandemic stronger, and local leadership shouldn't be excluded from that as well. So I think it's a huge opportunity.
I'm curious. I want to go back to the blue sky and the magic wand question, because I love those questions. And as a journalist, quite often when I'm talking to folks about difficult topics and big problems they're trying to solve, that's one of the questions I ask is, okay, if you could do anything, what would it be? What are your priorities? And I'm surprised at the number of people who get angry at me when I ask that question. And they're actually really uncomfortable with it. On so many levels. So I'm curious for both of you, Carolyn and Katie, when you've asked that question, what are some of the responses you're getting and how comfortable are people with them?
Yeah, I think it is a question that can catch people a little bit off guard. Or what we found is that people don't get angry, but that like their blue sky magic wand thing maybe is like a fairly concrete or small ask, right? Mm-hmm. And it can take a little while of talking and hearing your neighbors talk to really get into that, what would this look like? And I think a cool example of both people's answer to that question and also how this process in general is moving from things we sort of already knew were priorities to how we're better understanding those priorities by listening to Vermonters. So housing obviously is probably the number one topic that we're hearing from people around the state. We know there's a housing crisis at all levels. Access to housing is a big deal. And again, that was a bucket that the legislature had already said, we're going to put more of this ARPA money in the future into housing. So in some ways, we're hearing what we already know. But in multiple places, in multiple conversations, this idea of like intergenerational supportive housing that is addressing both the needs of our aging population who want to age with dignity and addressing the needs of young families, helping address childcare concerns, helping address homeless populations. Like a lot of people are saying, let's not look at these as separate problems. Our magic wand is like, could we be creating housing? Could we be creating community that really was addressing the needs of all those populations at the same time, bringing them together? And again, then as a policymaker, like you kind of get like, oh my God, how would we do this? How would we do it successfully? But I think that's a good example where people are dreaming, are saying, I don't know how I do this, but this is what I want my community to look like and feel like. It's not just a question of the physical infrastructure of the house. It's the people who are in it. It's how they are together, how they're living together and supporting one another. And I think that's a really exciting example of how having this conversation provides some nuance and excitement to, again, some things that we know, because there are definitely folks who are saying, why are you going around and asking these questions? We know what we need to spend money on. We know what the issues are. I think that's more where we see the like kind of anger and resistance. But I think we're going to have a really good story to tell. And the other thing I want to highlight about our process, I mentioned that legislative committee where maybe someone is taking good notes. So we have really designed our process as a qualitative analysis light research effort, right? And so we have these note-taking templates for each conversation we do. We also have an online questionnaire. So if someone who doesn't come to one of the meetings just doesn't have time to do that can fill out a questionnaire and answer those 3 questions. We're also having some smaller intentional kind of will come to you conversations with communities who might be less likely to access one of these big countywide conversations. And all of the feedback we get from each of those are fed into the same database where, a discrete idea that someone typed, a thing that, like when I'm note taking, I try really hard to actually capture the words that are coming out of people's mouth. And then our consultant, who's a great qualitative analysis researcher, is coding them, right? So we can see like, okay, this is about housing, but this is about elder housing. This is about homelessness, like, and Katie, as you said, not starting with the topic, but letting the topic come out from what the data is showing. So all of that is to say, I think the product that we're going to have at the end of this is going to do a really nice job of saying, yes, the legislature had those 5 buckets right for the most part, but here's the detail we were missing. Here's the nuance that we're missing. Here's how we do it in a way that's really responsive to what Vermonters are telling us they need.
I love that you said housing. I love that was your time, because I was going to say that same thing. That's what we're hearing all over the place. So I'm sorry. Emily, you were gonna.
No, and I've loved every time I've ever been able to lead one of these dreaming projects. And I usually make people like doodle first silently before they have to have a conversation. There's all kinds of like really brilliant, fun ways to bring out the best ideas in people so they can think big and aren't intimidated by thinking big. But I wonder, so let's say everyone has these brilliant dreams of housing, which I certainly do myself. And we realized, referencing our last ARPA conversation, that the biggest barrier standing between most communities and their ability to build more housing is our wastewater system. And so every municipality in the state spends their ARPA dollars on sewage. How does that feel for Vermonters? Like what? Like, it's like, I can see that like that is actually sets us up for like root cause transformative change. And it's so like,
it's not what anyone's dreaming about. It's not what anyone's dreaming about.
But it's the key to unlock the dream.
And so, Katie, like we have a marketing campaign for wastewater infrastructure that we can just send a sliver of ARPA dollars for unlocking Vermonters' dreams. But actually, this makes me, now I have a question I want to ask you, because I know in some cases this is underway already, and in some cases, and I'm curious about from where you sit, who are having these conversations. I think I had a bit of a conversation about it with the Vermont Housing and Conservation Board, which is a lot of the state dollars for housing are sort of going through them and then they are meeting it out. And we talked about, so we've identified these different pots, right? There's a pot of money going to the state, there's a pot of money going to municipalities, there's a pot of money going to schools. To what extent is anyone, either at the local or state level, helping people think about how they're leveraging those dollars, right? Because as Emily said, if in fact, pretty much every municipality just needs to really focus first on stormwater infrastructure, wastewater, water, is that, but if they can, if they're partnering that with some other state dollars that are, saying we're doing this so we can build this housing development with these state dollars and, the school, it's going to be on the school's property. I don't know. You can imagine what the dream might be. That's where I see this big opportunity. And I don't know who are the people who are helping facilitate those conversations, if that's happening at the local level, how we can help it happen. Because I think that is smart and potentially allows you to tell these bigger stories about the infrastructure piece, then unlocking the things that maybe feel more exciting or visible to Vermonters.
So
Thank you, Carolyn.
we do a lot of that at the league. In my role, I do a lot of that with communities. The RPCs also are doing it. So both of us together are really supporting municipalities. And, I feel like a lot of what I say to towns when they ask, in a webinar or something, can I do this? And it's like, well, it depends, right? Because the regs are so sort of broad. It's like, I need to understand better what your project is, but I've had a lot of conversations. What can we do for housing affordability? What can a town do? I'm like, there's so many things you can do. But you're not going to change the housing game in your community unless you have water and wastewater. And walking some municipalities through that discussion is like, I never thought of it like that. Like, you're not going to have smaller single family homes built unless you have municipal water and wastewater. You're not going to have multifamily housing built. That's the first question a multifamily housing developer will come in and ask is, do you have municipal water and wastewater? If the answer is no, you're not going to do a project there. You just can't. So it is, I know that sewer isn't the hot topic on everybody's mind, but I'm all for rebranding sewer. I am. I think it's the key to unlock everything that we want to do, water and sewer, housing, businesses. I'll use the example of the Guilford Country Store and Cafe, that little cafe piece in my old community. Never would we have had the cafe part without municipal water. So, and having municipal water and sewer there completely changes the type of business that can be had there that has broad reaching impact for the community in terms of benefit. And, but for water and sewer, right? You wouldn't have any of that. And that's just small. You're not going to have a brewery. You're not going to have any of those other things in your community unless you address it. And it's not just big wastewater. I'm not going to go too into it because I feel pretty confident that Chris Campney from Wyndham Regional Commission.
Yeah, really went deep.
But this is how you begin the rebranding. You need to get like all the hot Wyndham County influencers in here talking about sewer.
Yeah, and
So
I was going to use
everybody
a pun,
knows.
but we have FCC rules, right, Olga?
Yes, we do.
We're going to talk. I can say poop.
You
right?
can say poop. Yes.
Say poop. I was going to use another word, but
You can also
That's
say
it.
something like, "You're in good hands."
Went on a tour of the Rich Earth Institute yesterday. Speaking of
nice.
such
So
things, so
bummed.
I learned even more about recycling.
There's so many alternatives,
So that was
right?
fun.
Mm-hmm.
So,
And I think it is good for people to know who are listening that I'm certainly not an expert on all the ARPA guidelines, but there are some very high level things that the federal government said this money can be used for, and that wastewater infrastructure, clean water infrastructure was one of them. Right. So
Definitely.
to the extent that people, because the other thing this happened in our conversation was we know this money can't be used for anything under the sun. One glaring example in Vermont is it cannot be used to pay down public pension systems, which is another financial need we have here in the state that ARPA dollars cannot go to. But there are other things that probably we're going to hear from people that they really need that these dollars cannot go to. And we made a decision to say, again, we're not going to put those boundaries around those ideas. Let's hear what people need. And then as we're analyzing it, we can say, these are the things that are going to be great candidates for ARPA money. These are the things that we're hearing Vermonters say they need, and we need to identify other dollars to address those.
And
So-
when you talked, sorry, go ahead.
Oh,
Olga.
I was just going to say, I need to jump in because we're just about out of time for this first half of the show. I know it went like that. But quickly, Katie or Emily, is there anything you want to leave listeners with before we hear from some underwriters?
Leverage to Carolyn's. I didn't talk about that. And if I can talk about it when we come back, maybe.
Definitely.
Perfect.
Thank you. Okay, everyone, stay tuned. The Montpelier Happy Hour on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro. We'll be right back. Welcome back to the second half of the Montpelier Happy Hour here on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro, your community radio station. You can also find us on Brattleboro Community Television, as well as our Facebook page, our Montpelier Happy Hour.captivate.fm webpage, and wherever you find your podcasts. Hey, Emily, we need to remind our listeners of something.
The views and opinions expressed here on the Montpelier Happy Hour are those of the host and the guests, not the radio station, not the social media channels, nor anyone's employers, partners, loved ones, or anyone they happen to run into in the street. It's just the hosts and the guests' opinions and views. Thank you.
Which, if you missed the free footage on Facebook, you'll know we have plenty of them.
I'm feeling very liberated to
Oh,
own my
me
opinions.
Yes,
I really also
please do.
want to remind our listeners who might not know that this is a full Windham County women contingent that we have here on the show today. Because even though Katie and Carolyn both defected a little bit and moved up north, they still have their hearts and their spirits in Windham County.
It's so true.
And Carolyn sometimes will sing the Green Street Elementary School song if we're.
I've got a lot of friends at Green Street School, and I hope that you do too. When we all get together, I hear myself singing harmony with you. Thanks, Anthony Speranza.
That's
You're
brilliant.
awesome.
Windham County women just are the best. That's all there is to it. So, Katie, right before the break, you mentioned, and for those who are just joining us, I'm speaking with Katie Buckley from the Vermont League of Cities and Towns and Carolyn Wesley from the Vermont State Senate, and she's the chief of staff for Senator Becca Balint. Katie, right before the break, you were talking about leveraging funds and how communities can do that. I'd love it if you would just quickly circle back to that.
Sure. Carolyn mentioned that, and the message that the practice that the legislature took during the last session of withholding some of that money and seeing what's going to come down the pike, that's the same message that we're giving to municipalities to take your time, be patient, be strategic, because some of your priorities of what you want to accomplish, leveraging is the opportunity to leverage now is like never before. So all of that, $1 billion, not all of it, but a lot of it will flow through so that the local ARPA money can weave into it to leverage more. So I'm going to go back to sewer since we've been talking so, passionately about it. If you thought about doing a sewer project, but it was just out of reach, suddenly it's in reach for you. So your local dollars might either seed a project or be a gap closer for your project or somehow in between. And, there's infrastructure money that could be landing. There's all of this swirling world of dollars, federal dollars that could be coming down the pike. So making that priority list might not be funded with ARPA, but it could be another funding source, or maybe there are components of your project that could be ARPA with some of those other dollars. So the opportunity to leverage is enormous right now. And that's the name of the game. And it's going from a vision, just an idea to a shovel in the ground. And there's just great opportunity to leverage right now. And we work with communities and, helping them understand what that means and ways that, and I'm sure lots of other organizations, I think we're one of many. So
I think for ARPA, for me, it's about leverage and levers.
Very nice.
Being able to leverage and pull a lot of different levers at once.
Should be a subtitle of the report, please.
Happy to. Put that in the brain bank.
Yep.
We can put it, we have it in, it's official now, it's on a podcast.
It'll be copyrighted to Olga.
Yeah, we'll cite Olga with
Intellectual
little
property.
asterisks.
Yeah.
Can I share one sort of leverage example that I think is, because I think the infrastructure funds that are lost somewhere in Congress feel a little overwhelming and out of reach right now for some people, myself included. The paper is getting more and more depressing every day. But what is very sort of possible in here right now is that we have significant rent stabilization dollars from the feds that are here right now. And so if someone invests in housing right now, there's an opportunity for people moving into that housing right now to have their rent paid for a year. which creates a level of safety and security for developers that we have never seen the likes of without wild machinations that Katie has spent previous time in her career focused on. And so that's like just a really valuable, like straightforward leverage blending opportunity for towns and for Vermonters to take.
And you use the word developer. It doesn't even have to be a developer.
No, I just mean like a person who wants to develop.
Yeah,
it is kind of a four-letter. I think that's another thing Vermont needs to rebrand. That's kind of a four-letter word, developer, and people get very scared about it. So I appreciate you. Could be anyone.
Yeah, I mean, I could have a big Victorian and carve it into 3 apartments. And each one of those apartments I could rent to somebody who's getting rental assistance, and I have guaranteed rent.
We could it's carvers instead of developers. How's that one?
You could what?
Carvers. That one doesn't really work.
Call them housers.
Housers.
Houser.
Brattleboro that's converting part of its municipal building into rental units.
I'm a citizen houser. That's what I do.
Oh, I like that one. I like citizen housing.
The Hoosiers were some sort of movement before they became a sports team.
Associated with Indiana. That's all I know.
But it was I'll look that up later.
Okay.
So I know we want to talk a little bit about like more of the public process. But before we do that, I was hoping, Emily, on the break, you talked about social infrastructure. And is now a good time to kind of feed that into the conversation? Because I think that's a kind of good foundation.
Sure, yeah. I mean, in the limited conversation, part of these conversations I've participated in, I feel like that was a little bit of a redundant sentence there. We talk a lot about physical infrastructure, housing, or broadband. Those are sort of the two that keep on coming up over and over again. But the social infrastructure piece is just as
Don't forget sewer.
Hardly, do people name sewer in these public?
No, they don't. Well, Katie did.
Yeah. Okay.
And actually, to be fair, we just had a wonderful conversation with Essex County, which is our smallest population, and they had a great select board member who had a lot of really wonderful ideas for his community, but also really stressed that sewer infrastructure was kind of at the bottom of it. So some people do, but mostly municipal officials.
Lovely. But the social infrastructure is the next piece of that. And some of that is sort of the social supports that are funded and created and planned and thought of around, say, if we're looking at young families and older Vermonters living together, what sort of needed to make that work in a meaningful way, and build that trust, and what systems do people need to really maintain that as a livable community. And then there's the much more practical social infrastructure pieces that are more named, that maybe Congress will find their way through, and we will then have in Vermont, things like family medical leave and funded childcare and affordable health care that give us the space to be able to show up in the communities that we want to, both to participate in these conversations, but also to make the best use of the parks that I heard people calling for, or the renewed green spaces, or to actually have the time to go access their farm that is newly invested in, their local farm that's newly invested in, or to, in this amazing blended community with older and younger Vermonters, like maybe then the parents of the younger Vermonters will have time to visit with the older Vermonters, those kinds of things. And so that is like very much a necessary part of this dreaming that I think I just want to continue to name over and over again, that social infrastructure aren't separate ideas.
I appreciate that. And I think after we're still having these conversations, we're still gathering information and analyzing it, but certainly anecdotally, having sat in on a lot of them, housing definitely is rising to the top. Climate is rising to the top, which also has both physical and social infrastructure components to it. But then probably the third thing are all types of workforce related concerns, particularly around workforce shortages in the caring professions, right? So it's maintaining quality childcare providers, it's maintaining nurses and healthcare providers. There is a disproportionate shortage in people who provide services to those with developmental disabilities. We had one of these smaller conversations with the Vermont Developmental Disabilities Council, which has both people with disabilities, caregivers of people with disabilities, and and service providers. And they had a really tragic story to tell about how hard it is for people to find, care providers to allow them to stay in their own homes, maintain some dignity, get the services they need. And then even, those are all kind of underpaid care professions and just broader workforce challenges because of our demographics where, people in trades people know they're plumbers and electricians and their local folks are retiring and they don't see the next generation of people coming up to fill those roles. So that seems to be sort of across industry, across community. It's part of our demographic challenges. It's part of our wage challenges. Are these jobs that people can feel secure in? Then it ties back to the housing. Do these people have places to live? Do they have childcare? So many of these things are interrelated. But
and I would add the social infrastructure that helps people get educated into those trades.
Yes.
Right.
Yes, absolutely. And so I think that, but the way people seem to be feeling it and talking about it now is just not having the sort of bodies in those roles that they know are needed to maintain their communities. And it's an interesting process. And Emily, you can probably speak to this as well as a legislator, but I know there's been a lot of conversation about, because these are one-time dollars, there are those who want to put some boundaries around, like, what does a one-time investment look like? We don't want to necessarily stand up a new program with these dollars that then wouldn't have a long-term funding source. But I think there are one-time social infrastructure investments you can make. And as Emily was just saying, education investments can be a really good example of that, right? Because if you provide a college course or an apprenticeship to someone once, they then have that for the rest of their lives. But Emily, I'm curious about how you are thinking about that as someone who really cares about social infrastructure. What is possible with these dollars? What some of the parameters might be? Because that's very much a question in the legislature.
Well, I'm not sure I entirely agree in the idea of one-time dollars, but I'll sort of get to that afterwards. I think if we think about sort of what one-time transformative infusions of dollars could do for social infrastructure, there's so many of them. Many of the systems that we've wanted to stand up historically, one of the things that got in our way was actually the startup funding. So one of the biggest problems around family medical leave insurance in Vermont was actually just the capital to begin the program and how long it would take before the program was fully funded to begin for Vermonters to see a return on that investment. And so if we can invest now, so Vermonters could immediately see a return on their investment in terms of their quality of life, it becomes a much easier lift, both politically and socially, and Vermonters get to benefit from it sooner. And that's a one-time infusion of dollars that would make that happen. Similarly, a lot of childcare facilities have significant startup costs to really set themselves up well. And the education costs, as we know, for childcare providers are incredibly high and their wages don't match it. And so a one-time infusion of education funding to make sure that early care and education providers in Vermont were well trained and didn't have to carry that student debt is powerful. Even a one-time infusion of clearing student debt makes a difference in an entire generation's ability to purchase homes in Vermont. And so that's a one-time sort of social infrastructure that creates transformative long-term change. And so there are so very many opportunities like that are ways we spend one-time money on people that creates lasting ripple effects for our whole communities that all seem very possible and right there in front of us. I will spend a moment on my soapbox that all of our money is one-time money. That we get revenue every year. That revenue is actually, in fact, different every year. And for instance, a lot of what we don't consider one-time money this year is, in fact, way higher than usual because people are spending in a different way than they have historically because of federal investment. And so I think I understand that we want to make sure that as we budget things that are long-term investments, we're going to have the money into the future for them. And that makes sense to me. But this very careful discernment between the two, I think, loses track of the idea that the revenues do come in fresh every year.
Well, I'm glad you're so well poised in a place to influence that discussion, Representative Kornheiser.
Thank you.
So my two takeaways is, was it, Olga, did you talk about leverage and levers during the 45-second break?
Or right when we came in, yeah.
Okay, so Emily, what you were just talking about feels like those levers, right?
Mhm.
What levers can we pull? Reduction in student debt. When you pull certain levers, what are the most dramatic levers to pull that have deep impact and ripple across many
Mhm.
different priorities? Like, I loved hearing you talk about that. And because it's Friday and I'm fried on Friday, that's why it's called Friday for me.
Oh my goodness.
Right? I lost my train of thought for the second
I
one.
feel like we might be like a communications marketing term. There have been so many great little catchphrases on this
We should have more
conversation.
regular
Women
happy
County
hour.
Women.
It's not
Yes.
Women
live.
County Women,
It's
Carolyn.
funny.
It so is.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It is so the levers piece. Thank you, Olga, for that. And then the second, I think this is what I was going to say. I'm just going to say it is, sure, even if it
Go
wasn't.
for it.
And now I lost it again. Oh my God.
Here, let me jump in while you're thinking.
Thank you.
Last one-time investment in social infrastructure that I think is very powerful is that there are a lot of places in state government where we know that if we invested more upstream, we would save money downstream.
Mm-hmm.
And we generally don't do it because we have to keep on still spending the downstream money. So we know that there's a lot of ways we could invest money upstream so that incarceration rates would go down and we wouldn't have to spend as much money on prison, in addition to the like terrible, horrific social costs of humans being incarcerated. But it's very, very hard for us to say we have the money to keep on spending on prisons and we have the money to prevent people from going to prison. And there are places throughout our public education system, places throughout our human services system, where if we could invest upstream for just a few years, we would save an enormous amount of money downstream that we could then move into the upstream costs. And so if we are profoundly limited in our ability to ever budget beyond the 2-year or even 1-year cycle, but if we could be thinking in terms of those 10-year cycles or even 20-year cycles with these dollars we have in front of us right now, those are other real opportunities for more leveraging than levers.
The word is investment. That's what it came to me.
Great word.
Sorry for the total squirrely brain. Like really us focusing on the word investment, that, one-time money we're going to spend, think of it as investment, and that your return on investment doesn't always translate on your balance sheet.
Yeah.
That if you were to think of community as, to monetize community, think about the value there. And investment is the key. And so that startup money is huge. What's the ROI on that, right?
Mm-hmm.
If you start to think about it relating to humans versus just dollar signs, it's incredible. Because sometimes investments on paper don't make sense. But when you start to look at the impact on society, it's a no-brainer. It becomes a no-brainer. And if we could shift thinking to have it be that way, that maybe that's part of the magic wand and the dream, right? But I wish we would just sort of shift the narrative on that and think of it in that way. And so, and we don't, we're driven by the dollar sign so much.
Well, I always find it interesting, and maybe this is happening, but as someone who's outside the process, I'm just not seeing it. But I always found it interesting that when municipal budgeting time would come around, you'd have the annual budget, the operating budget, and then you'd have like the 25-year capital budget, where the whole town, it would have it marked out. We need to replace this truck in this year, and we're going to need to replace that fire truck in this year, and here's the money and it always amazes me that it feels that the operating budgets aren't looked at that way. And I like what you just said, Katie, because to me, it seems like we kind of do need to start looking at these longer term plans rather than what the operating budget sometimes can feel very reactionary, rather than thoughtful and planned out. Carolyn, anything you wanted to add?
Well, I just want to let people know that our sort of public engagement process is still going on. Just yesterday, we announced the last round of conversations. We did already host one for Windham County, which was really well attended, but secret, like, we're not going to kick you out if you register for another county conversation. And also, there is one, the last one, November 16th, is purposely a statewide conversation so that anyone who wasn't able to go to one before or missed their county conversation can come. So that's up on the Pro Tem's website. And Olga, I'll send the link to you so you can share it wherever people are accessing this thing, which is like a multimedia. It's on the television, it's on the internet, it's on the radio. And the other thing I just want to say that we're doing, we've been trying to figure out who we're hearing from, right? Because we know that when we do these community engagement processes, there often are kind of usual suspects who come in. And so we've been doing some demographic data to try to figure out who we might be missing, who we might not be hearing from. And in many respects, we're doing okay. We're pretty representative by county. We're quite representative. We're pretty representative by race, which is great, although that's one where we think we can be doing better than Vermont's demographics from a standpoint of equity, right? Because we know that racial minorities in Vermont have probably not been as engaged in the legislative process, so we want to be hearing more from them in order for it to be equitable. A place where we're actually really out of whack with the adult population in Vermont is level of education. So we are super overrepresented people engaging in these conversations who have advanced degrees, master's degrees and beyond, even bachelor's degrees. But we are not hearing from Vermonters who have an associate's, a high school education or less. And so we're doing some work to reach out to that population. But I would just say to anyone who's listening, if you have ideas about how we can connect to those folks, reach them, make sure we're hearing their perspective as well. That's when we really want to make sure that we're doing some intentional outreach too in this last month of the process.
Thank you, Carolyn. We need to wrap up. I know, Carolyn, you need to go to another meeting, but before we do, just any last minute thoughts anyone wants to leave folks with? I'm seeing shaking heads. Fabulous. Hey, Carolyn,
thank
Katie,
you for being such wonderful hosts.
Thank you for joining us today. This has been so much fun. As always, you can hear the Montpelier Happy Hour on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro every Friday. And you can find us on iTunes and BCTV as well. And Emily's website, which is emilykornheiser.com, correct?
emilykornheiser.org. I am not a corporation.
.org.
I'm not really an organization either, but it's Emily.
Well, see, I didn't think you were a 501c3, so I didn't know you could do it.
You can, anyway, you can find all my stuff at emilykornheiser.org. Thank you so much for a great show, everyone. It was really fun. I hope we can get together again. Bye.
Have a great weekend. Bye.
Bye-bye.
You too.